welcome to Candoor, where candid conversations open career doors. I'm your host for the day, Shelby Schreier, and today we'll be having a candid conversation with Graciela Brewer, who is also a business school classmate of mine. Welcome, Graciela. A little on Graciela before we get started. Graciela is the Associate Director of Design Operations at restaurant tech company Toast, based in Boston. She attended the Missouri University of Science and Technology and studied information technology before discovering a passion for user experience, also known as UX, and starting her career as a UX designer and researcher at a Midwest-based health tech company. She enjoys pairing systematic thinking and creativity to solve tough problems. After spending several years solving customer problems, she decided to apply that skill set to helping companies become more proficient at user-centered design and putting their customers first. This pivot is what led her to pursue her MBA at Harvard Business School. As a newly minted May 2022 graduate, Graciela is excited to continue to position her career at the intersection of business and UX to create impact and help others. Graciela, it's a pleasure to have you again.
Yeah, no, it's great to connect. And, I really believe in the mission of Candour, so happy to be here.
Awesome. Well, I'd love to start out just a little higher level before we dig in. I'd love if you could tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, for sure. Let's jump right in. I think for the purposes of this, with the mission of Candour, I will share a little bit about my family and my upbringing, maybe a little more than I typically would than in a career conversation. So I actually grew up in a military household. My father was in the Air Force and he was somebody who was enlisted, which means that he was not college educated whenever he enrolled. And he is also a Nicaraguan immigrant, which makes me half Latino. And so growing up, moved all across the US, definitely bounced around from place to place and spent some time overseas as well. With my father being enlisted was very much a working class upbringing. And so fast forwarding from there into college age, that's whenever, as you mentioned, I attended Missouri University of Science and Technology, which is a mouthful, but I studied there basically a cross between computer science and business. And I really was doing that as a bit of a safety net. I didn't really know what I wanted to do. And, through happenstance, through an internship, whenever I was in college, I was able to discover the field of user experience. And I was really excited because then I was able to land my first job post undergrad, actually being a user experience researcher and designer. And so I was able to do that for several years before kind of realizing that I wanted to make a little bit of a pivot in my career. I had this really strong foundation of passion for UX, but also a lot of discontentment about the fact that companies tend to execute really poorly on user experience. And I was really passionate about solving that problem. And so I decided that I wanted to pursue that. And to do that, I felt like I needed to know more about the business side of things. And so that's why I decided to pursue my MBA. And somehow, for some reason, Harvard let me in, which still seems crazy even to this day after graduating. But that was a great experience. Got to meet great people like you and Christina. But from there, then have been able to, as you mentioned, land a job at Toast doing design operations, which is really in line with that mission that I just spoke to. And yeah, it's been really exciting ride, and I'm excited to see where I go next with it.
Awesome. Thank you so much for the overview. So I'd love to kind of dig into that point in time in that first internship where you mentioned it was your first exposure to UX and you fell in love. How did you think? How did from that internship did you decide like UX is the career for you? Because that really seems to continue to be this thread and this North Star throughout your career.
Yeah, so I think for me, I started actually at a different college and I was studying journalism and, looking at what I wanted to do whenever I was in high school and thinking about what my career was going to be, obviously, like for all 18-year-olds was pretty overwhelming. But I also tend to be somebody who's pretty analytical, but also pretty creative. And I didn't really know what career was going to suit both sides of that for me. And so to start off, I steered more into the creative side and was doing journalism, wanted to, potentially be like a magazine, like page editor or something like that. And I quickly found that that wasn't really for me. I wasn't really stretching that analytical side as much as I wanted to. And so that's why I ended up switching into where I ended up graduating, which was an engineering school and studying, kind of computer science light, as I like to call it. And I basically at that point, I still didn't really feel like there was a fit. Like it felt like, okay, I already made this transfer once, like this is a safe option, tech seems like it's doing pretty well right now. Like I can probably find a job here and figure it out from there. And it wasn't until I got a software engineering internship and I found out that they were starting a user experience team. And, for those who don't know, user experience really does encapsulate like how do you understand a process and make it better and analyze it and do, problem solving, but then also how do you make it aesthetically pleasing? How do you, come up with creative solutions and things like that? And so I finally felt like, oh, I'm actually getting to use both sides of this, of myself for this. And so within that, even though that wasn't what my internship was for, I actually just proactively reached out to the people running the internship program and said like, hey, I heard you're starting this UX team. I don't know much about UX. This is really the first time I've heard about it, but it just sounds really interesting to me. And, they were really great and allowed me to learn more about it throughout my time in the internship, but then also let me position my intern work towards being able to showcase that I would be a good fit for it. So, it was, part, I think, just serendipitous timing, which is really great. But I think also it was just kind of being aware of my surroundings and taking note of something that maybe was a better fit than where I was already placed and, kind of looking around rather than just looking straight ahead.
I love that. Was that scary at all to do in your first internship to like reach out to another team to learn about it? Or I guess I'm just thinking about back to myself in college. Were there any hesitations in going about that process?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely was pretty nervous about it. I think it was nice because in that specific instance, this company had like some people who were running the internship program that weren't specific to a certain team. So it's not like I was going to my manager for a team and saying, hey, I want to learn about this other team, which, in all fairness, I still think that's a completely reasonable thing to do. But of course, to your point, when you're in college, that just seems a lot harder to palate. It was kind of like a third party with the people running the internship that could kind of connect those dots for me. And I think that exists in most forms, even if it's not a formal internship. I think a lot of times there's probably people in companies that you can reach out to that maybe are not your direct manager, but might be able to make that introduction for you or help you learn more, or just have like a side conversation. So, if you do feel a little bit hesitant with that like direct report manager relationship, I think there's still other ways to explore if there's, something that's catching your eye elsewhere.
I think that's super helpful. So just taking a step back and looking at your career, I'd love to hear, what are some of the challenges that you've overcome in your career so far, whether that's specific to UX or even outside of UX?
Yeah, so I think like the first phase of my career, like the biggest thing that I was trying to overcome was just like confidence. I tend to be somebody really introverted, and I think it's kind of counterintuitive. A lot of people think like, oh, you grew up moving from place to place, so you probably just jumped right into new things and like knew how to immediately like be social. And it was actually the opposite. I feel like moving from place to place really, as somebody who's already introverted, made me just really shy, made me like keep to myself a lot more. And so I think like learning to overcome those tendencies and have confidence in myself and have confidence in my skill set was definitely the first challenge of my career. And I think that in general, it's really a mind shift change that happens whenever you graduate either high school or college, depending on what your college experience is, where, you know, I grew up a lot throughout high school and things like that, being like, yeah, I'm smart, but so there's always somebody who's smarter. There's always somebody who's like better at that test or, has like one other extracurricular, that sort of thing. So it wasn't really something that drove my confidence. And I think it's not until you really get out in the real world that you realize that there's so many ways for people to be smart or to be good at something. Like somebody could be like not book smart at all, but be super inspirational, or it could be somebody who's so good at rallying a team. And you kind of realize that all these different things in different ways that you can be good at whatever your job might be. And I think UX, finding something that really tailored itself towards the things that I naturally excelled at, I was able to build that confidence. And so I think that was like really the first phase of my career, was just being able to say like, oh, I am good at these things, and these aren't things that other people might necessarily be good at. Like I do have something unique that I can bring to the table, and there's value in that. And I think that like was really what supercharged what I felt like I was able to do, even on a personal level, was being able to embrace that self-confidence. And I think in more recent years, challenges that come to mind has been really just being kind of like non-traditional. Not a lot of designers go to business school, and just being able to continue to embrace the uniqueness, even whenever you sometimes can make you feel a little bit lonely because you realize that a lot of people around you maybe don't have the same background.
This is super helpful. And I think that confidence piece, as well as the imposter syndrome, is something that resonates with a lot of our advisees. Do you have any other suggestions for advisees who are listening on how to kind of ways they can build that confidence and kind of get over that imposter syndrome?
Yeah, I mean, It's like the never ending question, right? It's something that I think so many of us deal with. So I definitely don't have any, quick overnight solutions, although I wish I did. I think it is really just about being observant and kind of really trying to take stock of, what you bring to the table and how that might be different than other people, or maybe even if it is the same as another person and you realize it's a strength of yours, but maybe for someone, a few years senior in their career, it's an even greater strength, than taking the time to talk to them and to learn from them and really being able to understand the strengths of people around you. I think there's so much by just being reflective and kind of understanding of what different people bring to the table that can help you really just excel in your work anyway, but then also can help you on that personal journey of like, what does your future look like? And, I think it's really easy to do that in a comparative way of like, oh, that person's so good at storytelling and I'm not good at that or something like that. But I think if you take it from the approach of like, oh, here's maybe where they excel versus where I excel. And, how can I learn from my background, or how can I learn from the context that I'm within right now? I think that's super helpful. And like I said, as somebody really shy, it's also about just like being ballsy and not being afraid to actually put yourself out there. Like my company, we hired our first like female CTO really recently, and I was like really nervous, but I was like, I'm just gonna have 30 minutes with her. I just feel like I should meet her and just learn more about her, and just see, if there's anything, insightful that I can glean, even though I was just so nervous.
I love that. Well, I feel motivated right now from this conversation. I'm going to shift gears a little bit. For those who are interested, have heard of UX design, but haven't really worked in it, or for folks who work with other UX designers, I'd love if you could walk us through kind of a day in the life. What does a typical workday or project look like for you?
Yeah, so I'll maybe answer this in two parts. I'll answer a little bit more for like kind of baseline UX, and then I can answer it for design operations, which is what I do now, which is a little bit more niche, just because I think the blanket UX design will still be probably valuable for people. So in my career, I was a generalist. So in the user experience field, it typically breaks down into designers versus researchers. And there's definitely some specialties within that, but a lot of companies, that's kind of how they tend to break it up. Either they'll have generalists, so people who do the whole UX process from research to design, or they'll tend to break it up into people who maybe are focused on just design and people who are just focused on research, because they are two different skill sets. And so I think it's really helpful to have been a generalist, so I do have that overview, but they are two very different career paths, so what you're doing can definitely vary. So on the research side, that's going to be more of like, okay, let's actually talk to customers. Let's like kind of create visuals and journey maps and put a lot of sticky notes onto the page and really understand like what are themes that emerge when we talk to customers, and how can we better understand their psyche, and how can we better understand the end to end of what a customer needs our product or service to do, and how can we really like be insightful about that and bring those findings into other parts of the business. So that could be bringing it to designers who will then design the end to end, or bringing it to business folks who maybe those insights are going to have an impact on pricing or packaging or something like that. And the exact flow of that information is going to of course vary from company to company. Then on the design side, once again, either you just did the research or a researcher is passing off all of that amazing customer insight information to you. And from there, you're really trying to understand like, okay, what can we actually build? What are the pieces that we can put together to make these processes better for our customers, and doing that with a product manager, ideally, to be able to calibrate that with what are the business goals that we're trying to meet, how can we kind of like work within the restraints to create something hopefully functional and beautiful to make people's lives easier and better, while also kind of meeting the strategic needs of the business. And so that's kind of UX at a very high level. And then design operations specifically is kind of turning the lens inward of how do we actually run the product development process to make sure that users are fully incorporated in the work that designers and researchers do. So what are those transition points where like how often should a designer be collaborating with a product manager? When should they be like reaching out to an engineer to actually check the feasibility of all these beautiful things that they're designing, and then on a higher level, like what kind of funding do we give design? How many, designers versus researchers versus product managers, like what are those ratios? It's like, how are we really enabling the company to meet these goals for user-centered design? And so that's what I do today is the design ops side of things, is like, how do we actually run the design team so that we can do the best work in service of our users and our customers?
This is really helpful. And for someone who isn't in design operations but would work together with a team like yours, what's the one thing that you wish they knew?
One thing that I wish a UXer would know, or that like,
Or someone who's not in UX that's working together with UX or design operations, like would think about a little bit more.
yeah, no, I think that that's a great question. I wish that they would know a little bit more about just like the value of design being more than necessarily graphic design. And so some companies are really good at this. They really understand kind of the overview that I just gave you of like how we strategically are creating value for our customers and how UX is really part of that. But at a lot of companies, I think people hear design and they still just think pretty pictures. And they think like, okay, we'll build all of the stuff and then we just send it to you and we want it to be pretty. I think that a lot of UXers in the field know that that's kind of like fighting the good fight is like helping people actually understand that like, no, we have a real role to play in the business outside of just making things nice to look at. And that there is basically when I was applying for business school, a lot of my pitch of like why I want to do design operations is because there's a huge business value for doing UX well in a company. I care about it more from like the ethical standpoint, but companies also should care about it from the business standpoint. And so I think that that's something that if you're working with the UXer, is kind of like dig a little bit deeper and understand the ways that they're actually driving value and the things that they're doing, aside from their amazing skill set of being creative and making things look beautiful.
This is really helpful. And I guess just a related question, what's your favorite thing about working in UX design or design operations now? And what's your least favorite thing, which I think you were getting into a little bit there.
Um, yeah, my favorite thing, I think it is like for design operations specifically, it's like you're taking all of those same skill set you learn as just a UXer in general, and you're just turning them inward to the company. So in the same way that if you were designing a product, you would be asking, your customers, okay, how do you want this to work? What's the best way that this can work? How can we enable and empower you with whatever our product or service is? Now you're just asking that to your internal employees of like, okay, UX designer, what UX manager, UX director, whatever role, like how can I help you actually get better work out the door? Like what are the organizational roadblocks that are currently in your way for you to be able to do the best work that you can? And so it's really great because I think through that lens you can just kind of use all of the same skill set of UX. It's just you're applying it in a different context. And so I love that. And I find that really exciting. It's kind of like a meta layer of UX that I'm performing, which is great. Since obviously, in case you can't tell, I'm passionate about the field. Uh, I think Lee's favorite thing for design operations specifically is that, when you are asking people those sorts of things, that, you're kind of asking for a lot of feedback from people in addition to their day-to-day job. If design operations is executed well, ultimately you're making people's day-to-day job like better and more efficient. But along the way, it's a lot of like asking people to pause and asking like, hey, can you give me feedback on this? Does this seem like a good solution? Let's pilot something, let's iterate on it. And sometimes that can be like kind of asking people to pause on work that they're doing in their day to day. And that can be difficult. Sometimes that's difficult to be like, okay, hey, I know that that's like an immediate thing that you need to ship that's really important, but also I promise long term this is important too. Like, let's work together on it, and try and make sure we're looking at the long term vision, even though I know it's a little bit of a pain right now.
Totally feel that. And a bit of a related question for those tuning in who are really interested in kind of product design and UX, what's the one piece of advice that you would give them for especially students out here who haven't yet even started on that career path?
Yeah, I think the biggest advice that I can give, especially because it really was just lucky timing. I feel like I was able to get a full time job and get into the field just right before kind of it became as popular as it is now. And I think it is a lot harder to break into now. I think that there's a lot more people who are kind of trying to get that first job in UX. Um, and I think a way to really differentiate yourself is to find any way that you can to just practically apply user experience. And I think it's really common for people to put a case study on Medium or to like, redesign the Nike homepage. And that's great. But like everybody's kind of doing that. And it doesn't really demonstrate the skills of UX because UX is creativity, but within the constraints of an actual business problem. And so whenever you're just redesigning something, that's a little bit more of like showcasing graphic design skills rather than UX. And so I think like an example would be, even if your part-time job at like the dining hall or something like that while you are in college. There are things that you can do to show that you understand how to streamline a process. Like just do the extra thing to figure out the way to streamline the sandwich line or something, and like be able to speak to the fact that you can dissect a process and try out a solution and iterate on it and be creative. Like if you can find ways in whatever your current roles or even your extracurriculars are to apply those skills and actually be able to speak to them, then that's going to get you a lot further than just kind of having like a flashy portfolio of things that look pretty.
I really appreciate that. I'm also thinking about the sandwich line that definitely was way too long at my college. Um, so appreciate this. I'm going to kind of take a step back and level up a little bit and really appreciate kind of all this detail around a day in the life of kind of design operations and UX. Kind of thinking back over the course of your career, what are some of the greatest things that you've learned about yourself? And I know you've touched a lot on confidence. I'd love to hear any other kind of career learnings as you kind of reflect on the past, working years.
Um, yeah, I mean, I think like my biggest life takeaway as far as both kind of the intersection of personal and career is just to not think small. Um, as I mentioned, very working class upbringing. Nobody in my family was corporate. Getting like kind of a corporate job right out of school, I felt immediately very lucky and very like, oh wow, I didn't even think I'd end up here. Like this is crazy. I'm able to take a work trip and they pay for my flight and they pay for me to like, whatever, have dinner with clients or something. Like what a concept. And I was very grateful for all that, but I kind of thought like, okay, cool. I guess this is it. Like I guess this is where I've gone. And it wasn't until I really started to like challenge that, gain that confidence, move a little bit further in my career, and really start to ask myself, what do I want to do? Like, okay, now I kind of have realized the things that I'm good at. How do I want to apply them? Like, what is going to make me happiest? Like, what is going to make me feel most fulfilled? And it's kind of just been this incremental journey of like kind of asking what if like a little bit further and a little bit further. Like when I first started considering pursuing my MBA, I was like, okay, well, maybe I could do like an online program or something like that. And then I was like, well, maybe I could do like a part time and then like also be working at like one of my company's other offices. And then it was like, well, what if I did do full time? And then it was like, well, what if I did apply to Harvard? Like, it's just like kind of all of these things of kind of pushing myself. And then, going to Harvard, and I think probably any MBA program really kind of supercharges that because you are surrounded by so many people who are doing great things, like you and Christina starting Candoor or something like that, or your professors who have been CEOs of companies or whatever it is. You start to kind of realize like all of these doors exist, as far as these different options that you probably never even considered before. And I think on a personal note, that also happened when I was in undergrad and I became pregnant with my son. And that was a completely unplanned pregnancy. And, that was just like such a blessing that I never really expected to happen. And I just at the time could only see right in front of me of like, oh my God, I'm in college, I'm going to have a baby. And it wasn't, until I went through that experience that I realized how much happiness and fulfillment and confidence in its own way that gave me, that definitely applied to my career. And so I think it's just about like you kind of continually being able to push myself and understand that like the ceiling gets higher and higher, and you should continue to push it higher and higher.
I love that advice. And that kind of brings me to that next question. A lot of folks in our community ask about work life balance. And I think for you, you had business school or actually working in your job. And on top of that, are a mother as well. So I'd love to understand, how do you create work life balance and how do you practice self care within all of that as well?
Yeah. I mean, I think like it's funny because I remember in business school, so many people would be like, "Oh wow, like how do you balance like being in school and having a kid?" And my son was 6 at the time, so I was like, "I promise, having a 6-year-old in business school is way easier than having a newborn in undergrad." So this time around, it's actually easier. Um, but yeah, I mean, I think in general, and this is harder. I will be completely honest. This is of course harder to do earlier in your career, whenever you're just trying to get your foot in the door towards whatever path you might be on. But I think as you do start to get your second, third, fourth job, whatever it might be, I think it really is about just kind of picking a place that's going to respect you as a person, full as for all of the parts that encompasses. My mentality when it came to work has always been that I am more than willing to work the hours when I understand that there's like an actual need to work extra hours, but I will not work till midnight just because it is arbitrarily decided that this is a place that we work till midnight. And so I think a place that really gives their employees respect enough to make those decisions, like you know when your project is important enough or when that deadline is tight enough that you will put in the extra work and you'll do it on the timetable that makes sense for you, then that's something that's always been really important to me. That's always been more important to me than, like title or pay or something like that. And of course, it's all balanced. Everybody has different priorities of like what that kind of matrix looks like across those different factors. But I do think that we're pretty lucky too, and that COVID has made that much more accessible. Like, obviously, it's by no means perfect, but I think like so many more companies are going to be understanding of if you do have not even necessarily kids, but if you have a family member who's aging that you need to take care of and you do need to work from home one day a week or whatever that looks like. I think just like those different forms of what being a good employee actually looks like in practice are just becoming much more acceptable. So I think vetting a company for that is really important. If you're single and you're 20, it's your first job out of school, and maybe you're like, I will break my back and then the next job will be good, that's totally fine. Like everybody has those trade-offs to make. But definitely once you start kind of earning your place in whatever career path you've chosen, I definitely think mental health wise and work-life balance wise, it's worth it to actually kind of take stock of who are you actually working for and how are they going to view you.
So, question for you there, Graciela. How do you vet a company before you work for it?
I think there's a lot of signals, it's sad because you learn those signals more as you experience the bad side of them. I know that was definitely my experience from like my first job was I think you don't know what you don't know, so it's really hard that first interview out of college where you're just kind of like, oh, you want to offer me a job? That's great. I can't think of a single other question I would have for you other than will you employ me? But I think it is like being able to kind of go through and do your due diligence. And I can give like a few examples here. So my, as I mentioned, my last company, there were some things that they did like work-life balance that I didn't love. And whenever I was starting at Toast, I was able to really notice a lot of small things that were indicative of the fact that it was much different than my last company. And so, especially if you have an internship, then you're getting kind of the inside track, which is great. You get more info that way, of course, than doing an interview. But, I think an example is both my last company and Toast had like recognition platforms, basically just like, oh, send like points to your teammates, like give them like a high five, like just shout out for people who are, doing things and we want to recognize and appreciate each other. My last company launched that and it was like crickets. Like no one was using it. And whenever I started at this company, it was like people are constantly sending thank yous to each other. People were saying like, oh, hey, like, thanks so much. Like, you helped me with this thing that I like randomly asked you about, like, whatever. People were sending it to me, even though I was just an intern. And, that's just like kind of a small example of how you can take note of those little things of the ways that people interact with each other to kind of understand, like, is this a supportive culture? Is this a culture where people are actually helping one another and recognizing one another? Even if it's like, oh, so and so's on maternity leave, are people talking about that like that's a totally normal thing? Or are they talking like somebody being on maternity leave is just like a completely unacceptable waste of time? I think it's just like being observant of culturally, how are people talking about one another? How are people talking about the work? And how are people talking about, their direct reports and their managers?
This is some really great advice. I know we're coming to the end of time here. I could go on for a while, but I have two more questions for you. One, you talked a lot about dreaming big as a big learning and kind of always thinking, what if? So, first question for you, Graciela, what is the next, what if for you? Where do you see your career going, 5 years, 10 years down the road?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, I'm really enjoying my time at Toast for a lot of the cultural reasons that I just listed. Like, it really does feel like a good fit for me. I think I do see myself staying here for a couple more years, and really seeing kind of all that that has to offer. And I think past that, I think there's a few different paths I could go. I think either thinking that I would want to be like just a straight user experience director, or VP, whatever that would look like, but just basically a user experience leader at potentially a bigger tech company is something that I think would be really great. Or a different option that I've considered is going in the VC route and helping, portfolio companies better understand how they set up UX teams right from the start, and how they can, even at a startup, be able to be thinking about their users and kind of setting up a company culture that steers towards being able to accommodate users' needs and making them happy. I think I will almost kind of caveat my own advice that I gave before, which is that I do think it's about like dreaming big and not like capping yourself, and understanding that like sky's the limit. But I think it's also about like not stressing so much if you don't understand like exactly where you're going to be in 8 years. Like I think it's really easy for people to get kind of wrapped up with like, oh, I don't have like this step and this step and this step. It's like, I think as long as you understand like how you're pushing yourself and how you're facilitating your own growth and what those possibilities could be, it's okay if you haven't like picked that specific path and feel like you have the 20 steps to get there completely lined out at this second in time.
This is super helpful. My final question for you, you've provided so many amazing kind of tidbits and pieces of advice throughout this interview here, but if you could leave those watching with kind of one piece of advice for those just starting out on their careers, what would that piece of advice be?
Oh, yeah, I think this kind of appeals more to the fact that I said I was really shy and things like that. I think that there were so many times that I just didn't really pursue something because I was scared early in my career, and just kind of let that stop me, of just like, okay, well, what if that, what if maybe I shouldn't pursue that group because they're going to think that I'm stupid, or maybe I shouldn't, reach out to that person I think I could learn from because like I'm just going to be bothering them. And I realized that a lot of those things that I stopped myself from were just based on assumptions. And, my thinking was already immediately flawed from the start because I was making all of these assumptions that I was letting stop me. And so I think it's really just about learning to kind of pause and realize if you are making those assumptions, and being able to question them and not let them hold you back. I think it's usually not as simple as like, oh, I'm shy, so I'm not going to do that thing. It's like, no, I think most people have more complex thought patterns than that. It's tends to be like, okay, well, I'm not doing it because reason A, B, and C, or something like that. But if like 2 of the 3 reasons are assumptions that you've made up in your head, then maybe it's worth questioning them and kind of figuring out, was that the right choice, or should I push myself to go further, or should I push myself to do this thing, or maybe even do a completely different thing because I had, misrepresented these assumptions in my head or something like that. I think it's just kind of questioning all of that as you're looking at the world around you, and kind of figuring out, what the right step is.
Well, thank you so much for your time, Graciela. I'm so excited for everyone to watch this and learn from you. I certainly am learning a lot, and just want to express from the bottom of my heart and from other Candoor teammates, we are just so excited to have you within our community. I'm going to officially close out and thank everyone for tuning into this episode of Candid Conversations. If you're a college student or recent grad from an underserved background interested in connecting with this amazing Graciela here, apply at www.candoor.io using referral code Candid Conversation to join our platform as an advisee. If you're an industry professional who shares our mission to democratize access to transformative careers, we'd love to have you join Candoor as an advisor. Until next time.